Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction, and welcome to the summary and ranking video for the animated 80s series. In this video I'm not going to do a recap or overview of each year, as you've likely all watched each of those individual videos before coming here. What I will do is present some of the statistics of the decade so we can talk about trends and compare years, and then I'll rank the years. I kind of went full nerd on this one and had a bunch of charts and graphs and such, but then realized that even though they were interesting for me to look at, they may not be interesting for you to hear about. So I trimmed down the analysis to hopefully keep this video from getting boring. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe if you love all things animated. My tune of the week on Instagram is Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers, so make sure to check that out too. Now let's dive in.
Yeah, it's a bit much.
Let's start with the broadest, most basic statistic that I could have put together for this, a raw count of the releases by year. You've all seen this in some previous videos, but here's what the release counts for each year look like. I'm not counting shows that were part of a variety program individually here, unless they are full-length episodes. It's obvious looking at this chart that we had a mid-decade peak, but saw that seriously trail off in 88 and 89. I was wondering if that was kind of normal, so I compared that trend against the surrounding decades. My answer from both was no, that's not the usual trend. Both the 70s and 90s had some low-volume years, but both ended with the same number of or more releases. So why did the late 80s trend down so far? Honestly, I have no idea. I couldn't really find any indication of decreasing toy sales or viewership numbers. The only real changes that you may be able to point at were the shift from the big three networks to a wider number of cable channels, which in turn increased the syndication opportunities for older shows, and the continuing popularity and growth of the NES and home computing. Maybe animation producers were trying to figure out how to sell new properties or compete against new sources of entertainment. Whatever the case, the numbers speak for themselves. Looking over the decade, I decided that the first way I wanted to break down these new releases was by category. I'm giving this a different meaning and context than genre, and instead decided to just broadly consider how the shows of the decade could be sorted. I realized that at their core, every show, for the most part, could be broken down into three specific groups: action, adventure, and comedy. For these groupings, I'm considering action to be the shows that qualify for this channel, with an ongoing good versus evil challenge motifs and teams of heroes and villains against each other throughout the series. Adventure is anything that deals with characters versus situations, or rotating threats, quests, etc. And comedy is anything that's, funny. Here's how the years broke down into that grouping. Action and adventure pretty much follow the same trend throughout the decade, but comedy is much more of a constant pace. And again, action and adventure pretty much follow the same trend as the general release trend. It's kind of got to because of toys, right? Those spike years were the ones where we saw massive playsets and huge character rosters and toy lines. I can only guess that it was the phenomenon of 80s excess in kid form, and that the toy-toon relationship proved to be less lucrative toward the end of the decade. It'll be interesting after I do the 90s, and possibly the 70s as well, to compare. Or to compare my findings here with other countries when I finish Japan and the UK. I'm curious about what kind of stories comparing them all will tell. Speaking of toys, the next thing I wanted to look at here was where the source material for all of these shows we got came from. I was kind of inspired toward this grouping from the Japan list, as so many shows that they got came from history or literary origins. That got me wondering about ours. I identified several sources to group the shows we got by, so I sorted the series into original concepts, toys and games, TV and movies, comic books, comic strips, literature, classics, meaning characters with a long existing history, video games, actors or characters, and imports. Here's what the overall breakdown of the decade looks like. And on this one we can see that those mid-decade years are heavily populated by the toy and game-based series, though there's also a decent mix of original concepts in there too, with imports being a surprising third place. It also looks like classics were the most consistent source for material throughout the decade, with a mostly flat trend. Looking at the high three sources individually shows a pretty similar trend between them all, but with a dip for both imports and toys and games in 1986. I was kind of wondering what may have happened in 86 to make things drop off slightly for a year, and I may be grasping at straws, but I think I have an idea about that. You see, January of 1986 was when the Challenger shuttle exploded, and myself and a lot of people of the same age watched it happen live on TV while sitting in school. I was in second grade, and I remember that specific event. The teacher had wheeled out one of those AV carts, and a couple of the surrounding classes gathered around each of them to watch the launch, because this particular launch had a teacher on the crew. And then it exploded, and we essentially all watched 7 people heading to an adventure in space die. I can only imagine that made producers a little hesitant to release sci-fi and fantastical cartoons that season. Let me know if you guys think I may be onto something there, or if you have other ideas. The only other notable trend from these sources is that TV and movie adaptations got a solid foothold and appeared to be here to stay. Can't wait to see what the 90s look like comparatively. And that thought about the Challenger led me to want to take a deeper look at genres. This breakdown is the most extensive of all of them that I did. I wanted to get kind of specific on how I assign labels here, so I actually dug into a lot of subgenres. I split comedy into sitcoms and slapstick, and put the skit shows like Looney Tunes and Woody Woodpecker into the slapstick group. Sitcoms were things like the Flintstones and Jetsons. I have a category that I call youth fantasy, where I put the younger geared fantastical shows like Popples and Winnie the Pooh, and I stole the slice of life category from Japan for things like Mapletown and Maxie's World. I've got one here for music, one for edutainment, which is disappointingly empty, especially compared to Japan, a variety category for the shows with various genre segments, and a mystery group that I thought would have more than just various versions of Scooby-Doo in it, but really doesn't. And lastly, I have action-adventure, which are shows with a contemporary setting and minimal fantastical components, and a few subgenres of both science fiction and fantasy. I've got pure science fiction, sci-fi fantasy, space western, military sci-fi, contemporary sci-fi, and pure fantasy. Looking at this supports my previous observation in that sitcoms are the most consistent subgenre over the decade, except for 1983, which is where, as I mentioned in the video for that year, action really started to get its foothold. In support of my assertion about the effect of the Challenger, we see that 1986 shows a decrease across all of the more outlandish sci-fi categories and a shift toward more contemporary and military sci-fi. I guess we were supposed to forget about the shuttle exploding and think more about the Cold War. For the most part, the breakdown of these subgenres is all over the place though, so let's take a closer look at a couple and see if we can recognize any trends there. Alright, so this is a closer look specifically at the various science fiction and fantasy subgenres I assigned. Here's the list of series I considered here and what categories I put them in. And here's the breakdown of how they were released. I like this one because it shows how much the variety of those types of shows expanded over the decade. We really started the decade with only a couple of classifications, but it definitely grew as we went. A couple of interesting observations I made from this were that all of the hard science fiction, meaning future settings and technology-driven, were all imports. That whole category is populated by anime. I'll also point out how contemporary science fiction is the most consistently popular category throughout the decade, with the shows in that group consisting of anything in a familiar, modern setting that uses extreme or fantastical technology. Action-adventure is pretty consistent too, which is the same thing but without the technology. I guess it's easiest to do world building when you only have to focus on the characters and gear. Fantasy shows also saw pretty consistent releases during the decade and pretty closely followed the same overall release trend, meaning they exist as kind of a consistent percentage of each year's lineup, with a lot of them honestly sharing similar backdrops. Then we have the military sci-fi, which is where I put shows like G.I. Joe and Starcom, which took advantage of our Cold War posture without necessarily being too rah-rah USA jingoistic. You should all watch my What Made G.I. Joe So Important Randomated Thoughts video for more of my opinions on that. My last notable observation from this chart is in the area of space westerns. I didn't realize when we were going through them that the three we got came in such a tight group, so I guess the genre really didn't catch on with a wider audience until later in the 90s. I'll be interested to see if and where it pops up when I do that decade. If we take a look at the other subgenres I put together though, we see that there was only one that has what I would consider to be a true growth trend over the course of the decade. Whereas everything else kind of followed that peaked bell curve, youth fantasy ended the decade on an upward trend with a fairly continuous year-over-year growth. It seems like the younger crowd was grabbing up more of the market share moving into the 90s, so I'll be curious to see if that continues. Slice of Life was looking like it would have consistent growth, but it trailed off at the end of the decade here. I wonder if that was because the genre wasn't holding viewers' interest, or if it was just due to the overall volume decrease during those same years. The categories we saw take the biggest hits here were slapstick comedies and sci-fi fantasies, with slapstick dropping off to nothing in the last year of the decade, and sci-fi fantasies looking more like a momentary trend than a lasting genre. Oh, and here's what a close-up of edutainment looks like for the decade. 3 shows, that's it. Japan had more than that in each of the 2 years I've covered so far. It's a good thing we had Schoolhouse Rock and some of those other between-show fillers to pick up the slack. Well, I guess we also had like Reading Rainbow. Oh, and 321 Contact. And Nova. And Mr. Wizard. You know what? Never mind. I guess all of our television education came in live action form. And we actually got quite a bit of it. No wonder us 80s kids are so damn smart. Guess those parent groups of the time did something worthwhile after all. Maybe I should do an episode on those, because there were a lot of them, and they were all kind of awesome. Anyone remember The Voyage of the Mimi? Anyway, that's it for my statistical breakdown and trend analysis, but let me know if you want me to look at any other categories or criteria, and I can maybe do a supplemental video or channel post on them. I'm also building a website, www.Dr.Animaction.com, that I'll post all of these charts on if you want to look at any of them more closely. My goal is to build the site into a one-stop source for all things animation and everything associated with it, but that's a big work in progress, and I've only just scratched the surface. For the ranking, I really wanted to try and be as objective as possible, taking something of a similar approach to what I did with my action cartoon ranking videos, but, well, there was a lot of criteria to consider. So instead, I'm going to present a couple of different rankings for you all to look at, and then I'll end with my personal, completely biased ranking. The first one I put together was one that assigned a value for originality by taking the total releases for the years and finding what percentages of those shows were based on original concepts, like in that chart that I showed you all earlier. Going by that criteria, this is how the decade comes together. We've got 1986 at the top, with 31% of the shows that came out being entirely original concepts, and 88 at the bottom by a pretty big margin, with less than 10% of those being original. I'm fairly certain, based on the individual year's videos, that no one watching this channel thinks 88 should be at the bottom, so let's try a different ranking. Let's instead see how the years stack up if we consider that most 80s of criteria with the toy-based series. Doing that makes things look considerably different, with those first few years of the decade stacking up on the bottom of the list at 0% each. This ranking puts 1987 on top, with that 85 to 87 golden period in the top 3. Pretty interesting. Let's see what else we've got. I know a lot of you watching love anime like I do, so what happens if we rank each year by its percentage of imports? It's actually pretty close to how the toy ranking looked, with 87 at the top of this one as well. Again, it's got those mid-decade years clustered at top. Unsurprisingly, 1982 falls into the bottom again as well. Pretty sure we were all expecting that. But how about if we look at the channel's core concept, though, and rank these years on the percentage of shows that fit into my definition of action? Well, that one's a lot different, knocking 83 all the way down to the bottom 3. But that doesn't seem right, though. I'm pretty confident we all felt pretty good about that year. Honestly, though, I've been a real-life data analyst for quite a while now, and I can think of about 100 other ways to rank these. I could add multiple values in if we wanted to, apply weights based on the significance of events during each year, apply negative scaling for years where something bad happened, really whatever I wanted to do to tell whatever story I want to tell. At the end of the day, though, I'm absolutely sure that any kind of sterile, emotionless ranking like that means pretty close to nothing to any of us. We watch these shows because we love them, and they make us feel something, and that's really the only ranking that matters. And that's what I'm going to do here in my personal ranking, with my own personal explanation of why I put each year where I did. I'll try not to retread much ground that I already covered in each individual year video, so let's get started at the bottom with my choice for worst year of the decade, 1982. I bet this was obvious to everyone, and I'd also be willing to bet that most of you agree. There wasn't a lot this year, with the exception of the quite excellent Incredible Hulk show and the first version of Pac-Man. Hulk did a great job of bringing the comic book to life, and Pac-Man expanded on the storyless structure of the game with a unique world and real character personalities. Everything else from this year I can pretty much do without, though. My choice for number 9 didn't do a whole lot better in most ways. 1980 had more to enjoy than 82, but not much. Thundar was probably the biggest draw from this year, as it came with a really awesome backstory and it had interesting characters and an interesting world. Force 5 was amazing, but it had a limited geographical release, so I can't let it weight the value of the year too heavily. Other than that, for me personally, only the new versions of Super Friends that came out and the Drac Pack catch my attention. Keep in mind that I'm basing this only on the shows that released this year, whereas the 1980 video considered everything that was on the air. If Battle of the Planets and Star Blazers were actually credited to this year, it would be a different story, but as it stands, I wasn't really drawn in by anything else, and none of these that I named here really felt like they truly represented the 80s either. For my number 8, I think I'll have to go with 1981. I know that I've stacked the bottom of this list with the beginning of the decade, but I'm honestly an 80s kid in its purest form, and like I said in the 1983 video, the real feel of the 80s started in that year. I love plenty of these older shows, but not really when they're facing off with 80s properties. If I was ranking all 203 shows from the decade instead of just 10 years, let me know if you'd want to see that video. A lot of them from 80 to 82 would be a little up there on the list, but the years as wholes have to stay down here for me. I'm personally not a huge Smurfs fan, so the year doesn't get many points from me there, which essentially leaves me with Black Star, the 2 Spider-Man shows, and Space Stars for my most valued series. And from those, Space Stars and the Spider-Man still feel like throwbacks from previous decades. Black Star is the only show from this year that really speaks to my 80s sensibilities, which keeps it down here on the list. 1989 comes in at number 7 for me because it was a pretty light year, especially in terms of action. Those of you who've watched enough of my videos know that I have a small obsession with Ring Raiders, but it only got 5 episodes. There was a larger handful of shows that really meant more to me from this year though, with the list including Beetlejuice, Camp Candy, a new G.I. Joe cartoon, Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, Captain N, and of course the Super Mario Bros. Super Show. I didn't catch the Karate Kid or Vitor when they aired, so they don't bring any nostalgia factor for me, and the G.I. Joe series we got included too much of the neon era of the toy line. The first season was pretty great, but I think it went downhill pretty fast compared to the original. I enjoyed Captain N, but even back then recognized how they butchered some of the characters, Simon Belmont in particular, and my love for the Mario series comes more from the live-action segments than the animated ones. So for me, that leaves the year with 2 great comedies and Chip and Dale. Number 6 would probably have to go to 1988, as even though some great stuff came out, a lot of it didn't really get any traction. Robotech came back for a second, which I loved, but then it was gone again. Same with the scant 13 episodes we got of Dino Riders. Superman was kinda cool, but he's never been one of my favorite comic book characters, and RoboCop was pretty cool too, but it paled in comparison to the movie. Beyond that, I watched a ton of Garfield and Friends, and plenty of David the Gnome on sick days and Sunday afternoons, but I never really loved them. The saving graces from the year from my perspective were A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, Police Academy, and Cops, which are all spectacular. But with only one of those being action, the year stays down here for me overall. And that sucks because Cops was probably in my personal top 10. Honestly, I could probably place 88 and 89 interchangeably on here, but I know that's not how rankings work, so this is the order I'm going with. So hey, this is getting pretty hard, pretty fast. I may have bitten off more than I can chew here, but I promised you guys a ranking, so I'm going to power through, as painful as it may be. And with that said, please don't hate me. There's so much to love from the other 5 years of the decade that it's nose and nose across the board. I had to pick and choose here, and my personal preferences may be a bit left field for some of you. But as hard as the decision was, my choice for number 5 is 1986. I hate doing it too, as there were so many shows I loved that came out this year. There were some greats that I never saw during their initial run, like Macron 1, Ulysses 31, The Mysterious Cities of Gold, or even Inhumanoids. I even came late to Galaxy Rangers, having only watched the full series in the past decade. I'm sure that just damaged a lot of my credibility for some of you out there, but I promise I've watched or am in the process of watching everything on that list in the years since. There were some shows from the year that I absolutely did watch and love though, including Silverhawks, Centurions, Rambo and the Force of Freedom, Ghostbusters, both real and original, Defenders of the Earth, Karate Commandos, and Laser Tag Academy. If I'm being honest with myself though, Silverhawks and the Centurions are the big competitors from this year against the others that I have left, and I don't think they're enough to challenge the remainders from the decade. Like my number 4, 1984, which makes this the entry where things really start getting messy. I can just imagine how many of you heard that and immediately said, but Transformers, but Voltron, but GoBots. And believe me, I get it. I'd love to say these top 5 are just one big tie, but that would kind of be the cheap way out. So I've made my bed, and now I'm going to lie in it. Yes, this year had the aforementioned Transformers, Voltron, and GoBots. It also had pole position and Mighty Orbots, not to mention my personally beloved Muppet Babies, and some secondarily, in my opinion, awesome shows like Danger Mouse, Turbo Teen, and a new Super Friends series. And yes, I consider Transformers and Voltron to be god-tier best of the decade entries. For me though, there were some other shows that just hit a little harder. Remember that this is just my opinion, and I'm by no means cheapening the value of any series that's not from a year in my top 3, but at the same time, you've all come to know me somewhat over these videos I've put out to this point, so me being me, I'm sure the rest of the list won't come as any real surprise. Okay, I lied. I think there actually are some surprises still waiting for you guys, and my first podium spot for the decade goes to, ready to be shocked? 1983. That's right, the year that gave us my absolutely cherished G.I. Joe only makes it to my number 3 spot. Even with He-Man, Dungeons & Dragons, Mr. T, and Thunderbirds 2086 coming the same year. Another 2 god-tier cartoons with G.I. Joe and He-Man, one of my personal favorite anime adaptations of the decade in Thunderbirds, and other awesome masterclass shows like Inspector Gadget, but 2 more years from the decade still resonate with me more. And honestly, I was 5 this year, so a lot of what I remember was from reruns and rebroadcasts. Plus, I didn't see Thunderbirds in its entirety, and as I've mentioned, my mom didn't let me watch He-Man initially, so I was a latecomer to both of those fandoms. For me, G.I. Joe was what this entire year was about looking back, and even my deep love of that single show can be overshadowed by a wider love of a collection of them. A collection like the one found in my next pick. For the silver medal on this list, I'm going with 1985, which I imagine is another unexpected twist. I mean, 1985 gave us Robotech, which I've made my feelings on very clearly known. We also got Jason the Wheeled Warriors, Sectars, Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, Robotics, a pair of Star Wars, and both freaking Mask and the Thundercats. That's not even mentioning shows like Gummy Bears and one of my personal favorite versions of the character in 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, plus a new Super Friends with the biggest roster it ever had. There were also the series that I didn't catch at the time, but stand out to me now from my current perspective with Transor Z and Captain Harlock and the Queen of a Thousand Years. And we even have She-Ra and Jem on the list, because even though I didn't watch and probably wouldn't have watched them at the time, I have since and can appreciate how good a series each was in hindsight. That's definitely an all-star lineup, and I wouldn't fault anyone who put it at the top of their own personal list. Speaking of which, I hope you all share your own rankings in the comments, because I'd really love to read them. But for now, I'll finish my ranking with the year that contains the largest number of series that I clearly remember, the broadest variety of pure, unadulterated 80s-ness, and the most toy-rific lineup of the decade. 1987 for me has the biggest and best selection of cartoons from all 10 of these years. Not only was this the year that we got TMNT for the first time, but shows like Sky Commanders, Starcom the US Space Force, Visionaries, Knights of the Magical Light, Bionic 6, Spiral Zone, Brave Star, Tiger Sharks, Dino Saucers, and DuckTales make for a very special lineup for me. Plus, we got a new adaptation of Gatchaman in G-Force Guardians of Space, a new version, and in a lot of ways the definitive one, of Astro Boy, and Saber Rider, which is another I came late to but quickly fell in love with. It may sound like I made my choice based on quantity over quality, but I really do prize the memories of each and every one of these series, and I'm very confident in choosing 87 as my personal best of the decade. Like I said, tell me yours below, or why I'm wrong about mine if that's how you'd rather be. Just tell me your thoughts, one way or another. And on that note, let's go ahead and bring this video to a close. If you don't agree with my ranking, then tell me about it instead of just leaving a dislike, because it really is just an opinion, and everyone else's on the subject is just as valid as mine. Leave a like if you enjoyed the discussion, and subscribe if you haven't already. As for the next series, I was thinking of doing animated movies before moving on to the animated 90s, but there were 114 titles on that list, so I doubt I could do the topic justice in just a single video. I'm thinking I could tackle them in 2 videos, with one being theatrical or direct-to-video releases and the other being TV movies, or do you prefer I just jump straight to the 90s? I can always do the animated movies as an alternate video each week. Let me know your thoughts, and if I move it to the alternate videos, I'll add it to my Patreon poll. Speaking of Patreon polls, this week there was a tie, so I picked an animated 80s UK from the candidates. Look for that one around Sunday-ish. I really appreciate you all sticking with me and supporting the series these past 11 videos, and I hope you're looking forward to what the channel brings in the future. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.